Welcome to another Numismatic Notes with Benjamin. I am Benjamin, and I've recently had my hair cut and my beard trimmed, so I thought I could take some time and share with you a story that's not a typical numismatic story. This is actually somewhat of a numismatic tragedy, and I apologize in advance if I show some unexpected emotion in this video. Those of you who know me as a teacher and know me as a numismatic researcher and somebody who's worked in numismatics for a lot of my life. Some of you know that I also a school teacher who became a librarian. Um, a lot of you know that I'm from Oklahoma, but a lot of you do not know that in my life I've experienced a good bit of trauma, and I don't expect to be treated any different by the public because I have, but I want to give you some insight into some things that have affected and had an effect on the numismatics that I've experienced in my life. And it all started back in the day whenever I was born in southwest Kansas and then moved to the panhandle of Oklahoma. We had a lot of weeds out there, and my mom worked at a bank, and she used to pay me a penny a weed if I would pull some weeds. And I didn't like pulling them a lot, but I enjoyed money. And so I still remember when she brought home 2 rolls of pennies, and I was able to start counting things in 100. And I knew I loved money at that point, and I knew that I wanted to be a banker just like my mother. And after a period of time, up through 7th grade, we stayed in the Panhandle, and then we moved to Oklahoma City, where I had to learn how to navigate in a school that had 4 or 5 times the number of people that the little school I went to in the Panhandle had, and it was pretty nice. I became of an age to get my first part-time jobs, and I worked as a sacker at a grocery store. I think I was pretty good. I became a cashier at the grocery store, and I started getting tips for jobs well done, and I put in an application at a bank nearby to become a bank teller, thinking, I'll be 18, I'll be old enough to do it. And circumstances allowed that to happen. And about the same time I started school in my university, I was able to become a bank teller at the First National Bank of Moore. So I'm still looking for a First National Bank of Moore banknote, and they're extremely expensive. So I still may be looking for one of those for a while. But I was very excited until the day I came into work, and then I had been promoted to the computer room, mainly because they'd fired the guy that was in the computer room. And so, I learned a hard way and on the job that I needed to work in the computer room. And part of my jobs in the computer room involved me taking cash letters, which are groups of checks that had been sent to our bank from the Federal Reserve Bank that other banks in the metro area and across the United States had processed our checks drawn on our bank, and they would send them in a bundle to our bank, and I would then unbundle them, and I would feed them through a Lundy that would read the little electronic numbers at the bottom of the check, and they would integrate into our IBM mainframe, and that's how your checks would clear your bank. And then we'd also create cash letters that our security guy would then drive down to the Federal Reserve in Oklahoma City, and we would have a great big switch off. First National Bank, I'm sure it wasn't this dramatic, but all the First National Bank checks would come to us. And we had 3 branches. We had a branch in Mustang, and or maybe 2 branches in Mustang. And then we had our branch in Moore. And we would get all those checks, and then we would pass out to all the other banks in the metro, all the other checks that we had there. And then the Fed would take the ones that went out of state, and they would send them to another regional Federal Reserve, and they would then sort them out for payments at these other banks. So this was something that was done every day. And, if we needed money in the teller room, we would also order coin and banknotes from the Federal Reserve. So it was a pretty easy process, and it was pretty amazing. Wasn't sure I liked it because I was also full-time in my university. I had, by this time, known that I was going to be a teacher for a year or two, or that I wanted to be. So I had a double major at this point. I had the Bible as ancient literature, and then I also had elementary education. So I was pretty excited about both of these degrees. And it was a year earlier that I had the chance to go to Israel and tour Italy as well at the same time. And, erase a whole lot of hours that I needed to take just, for the cost of actually going on a big trip. So it was wonderful. And that trip was amazing. I Some highlights were not getting to see the Pope because he'd broken his hip. So you can guess that this was a time of Pope John Paul II. But in Israel, we were able and mysteriously able to be in the West Bank. And we were actually in the city of Jericho on the day it was turned over to Palestinian control. So we were actually in Jericho. And we got off of our bus. Everybody was like, "Why are you here?" And "What are you doing here? It's Palestinians here." And I was excited, but as an American, I didn't think that anything would happen to me necessarily. And we got off the bus, and I'll be honest, I kind of felt like, on the TV show in those old westerns where everybody's firing guns up in the sky. They were doing that. They were doing that in Jericho, and they all looked like Saddam Hussein with great big mustaches and military fatigues. They were all Palestinian soldiers, and they were elated at the fact that they had been given control of Jericho by Israel. So there were Palestinian flags flying everywhere. I got kissed by more men in my life than I ever want to be. But, it happened that day, and it was a kiss of excitement and, Arab brotherhood, I suppose. And on that day, they seemed to love America. And I was excited to be that close to something happening in history. So it was a good life. I came back, and then it was my last semester of school where education majors have to do and plan their student teaching. So I had gone around to lots of schools, and I'd put in requests for which teacher I wanted to be my student teacher, and I ended up getting placed at Apple Creek Elementary in Murrah, Oklahoma, in a second grade classroom. And I was very happy for this assignment. And my story starts on the day that I had this meeting. It was an exciting day, and I got the assignment that I was hoping for. And at the end of my meeting, about 10 o'clock, I opened the door with this happy face and, this excitement to go and face the future and the start of the future. And that was when I realized that was the day I realized that April 19th, 1995 was going to be a day that I would never forget. And perhaps you will never forget that either. It is a day I've tried to forget many, many times in the almost 30 years since that horrible day. So much was exciting, as the day began. But at the end of that meeting, so much changed, and it became exciting in other more horrible ways. And here's what I experienced. Apologies. Here's what I experienced as I left this meeting at close to 10 a.m. Hushed murmurings in a hallway, students standing in clusters, a TV set up at the door of the library, and things on the TV that I'd never dreamed that I would see on American television. Because those of you who are not from America need to know that they don't really like to show us the horribleness of stories, and they certainly don't let us see death in the press. They'll talk about it, but you have to go to cable or you have to see video footage of it. It's not something that you see in live feeds. And what I was seeing on this TV made me think, what? I thought, I honestly, because I'd been to Israel recently, that what I was seeing was something terrible that had happened in Jerusalem. And I was fascinated, and I was looking to see if I could recognize any of the places, because I had just been in Israel, and I was like, what's going on? And I remember a classmate named Cassania was telling me that it was a code black. There was a code black. And I was like, what's a code black? Well, apparently a code black is where there are no more hospital beds. There are no beds available because They're all occupied by dead or dying people. No ambulances, chaos. And I was like, where is this happening? Is this like in Washington, D.C.? Is this Jerusalem? And I'll never forget her expression as she turned to me and she said, this is in Oklahoma City. And I was like, what? Where? And it was barely 5 or 6 miles from where I was at that moment that all this chaos that we were seeing on the news was occurring. I instantly went into shock because I couldn't believe it, because I was seeing people bleeding from the head, from the body, from glass. I fancy in my mind that I saw body parts, and I may or may not have, but the horror of everything I expected to happen while I was in Israel became my life in Oklahoma City. And the first thing that happened was, like I mentioned, the shock, and then I had to do something. I needed to do something because it was just insane. So another classmate of mine and a young lady that I was dating at the time, we all got in the car and we went to a blood bank. And Oklahoma City is a neat place because the Sylvan Goldman Blood Institute is an institute that was founded by the same guy who I think invented the grocery cart, because the grocery cart is an Oklahoma City invention. And we went to a local place to donate, plasma or whole blood, because in the press they were talking about the catastrophic need for it. There were no supplies, and there were perhaps people that were dying because there was no blood. So we found the location, and I don't think we ended up being able to donate blood that day because the line was close to 1.5 miles or 2 miles long of people just lined up to donate their blood. So it was shocking to see, because maybe many of you guys have been at blood drives where it's hard to get people to come in and donate, but they actually had to turn us away or ask us to come back in later days so that there would even be the supplies available for us to donate blood. And they had members of the public were standing up. They were not trained phlebotomists, but they were going through paperwork and they were getting people set up, and they were somehow violating law, probably, but we were able to get a whole lot of blood donated in the first hours of this bomb attack in Oklahoma City that destroyed the Murrah building. On the news, we kept hearing, outrageous expectations of death and violence and all this other stuff. And what we were seeing was fantastic. And I don't mean that in a good way. It was very gruesome. And there was debris falling and people getting hit and people dying after the explosion. And most of us on the ring of the city were unable to do anything about this. So it was somewhat tragic. And then for me, I still had to go to work. And so I wasn't able to go home and cry into my pillow. I went into the bank because when you work in the computer room, you usually work after hours and you do all the processing outside of your main day. So I would take all these cash letters and I would sort them out and prepare them for shipment the next morning to the Federal Reserve. And then several times a day, we would get cash letters from the Federal Reserve. So when I went in, I had cash letters that had come in the evening, and I would prepare them. And then I would take our things from the bank and they would be fed through the Lundy. And I would prepare cash letters to go to the Federal Reserve so that we could maintain commerce. And we were able to do that the first day, although I noticed there was a dramatically reduced quantity of checks that were coming in. Usually I had about 1.5 to 2 foot vertical stack of checks that I had to sort in. So several thousand, and they would all be fed electronically through the Lundy into our mainframe. And there wasn't very many. There was maybe that much. And I remember asking them, well, what's the deal with the cash letter? Apparently, the Murrah bombing is not too terribly far from the Federal Reserve Bank in Oklahoma City. And when the bomb went off, the Federal Reserve thought it was under attack. I mean, that was the rumor, but I would imagine that they explored this, and they literally thought that they were under attack. They thought that they were being attacked. And so they locked down the Federal Reserve. and nothing went in and nothing went out. For the first time in history of my bank, our security guard came back with the cash letter that we had prepared and we'd made available to the Federal Reserve, because they wouldn't let anybody in. They wouldn't let anybody out. And the next couple of days, it was the same until finally the amount of cash letters that I was receiving was down to this much, because we could only process our checks that were presented or negotiated with our bank or with customers that had accounts in our bank. And so we had literally boxes and boxes and boxes of cash letters that belonged to other banks and other people's accounts that were not the First National Bank of Moore. And we had no way of getting those checks to those banks. We had to keep them secure in our building and wait until the Federal Reserve opened again. They did not open for, it seemed like it was a week at the time, and I may be off by a couple of days. But we had places to hold all those checks in our bank because we ran out of money. We were very close to having no money in our bank, no coin, no banknotes, because we also ordered those on a daily basis from the Federal Reserve. And no other banks had coins or banknotes. We were having a problem in Oklahoma City that not too many people would remember, of how the banks were running out of money. I mean, pretty soon our economy was going to shut down in Oklahoma City because there was literally no money that we could get to the banks. So we had people who were scared. We had people who wanted to help, didn't know how to help, and we had no ability to do monies. This was really before debit cards. People were not used to going to a store and using their credit card to buy groceries. We were more of a cash economy than we are now. And there was nothing to be done for it. It was a terrible, terrible day. So my job in the computer room was usually over very quickly in the week after the Murrah bombing. But the day they opened the Federal Reserve, oh my God, I must have done 10 vertical feet of checks. And I had to work all night long, which I normally only did during the end of quarter or end of the year cycle at the bank. It took me forever to do those checks, because after you read them into the computer, you then turn off the mechanism that feeds them into the mainframe, and then you use the Lundy to sort in order the accounts, and you sorted them in order so that every check was in account number order, and then you would take those checks and you would go file them so that at the end of the month you could give customers their statement and all of their used checks. Because back in the day, you got all your checks back. But have you noticed that you don't get that anymore? Part of the reason you don't get those back anymore, I think, was rooted in the necessity of what happened at the Murrah bombing in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma in 1995. It may have been a plan in process already, but what happened was we had no means of negotiating checks for people. We had no means of providing them with cash, and so I expect that motivated the Federal Reserve to develop a computer system that they called Fedline. And within a year of that, we were able to, or within months, it seemed like, we had already started the process of doing everything through a computer that we had a direct line with the Fed. And so instead of physically presenting cash letters, we could actually create files and send them to the Federal Reserve, and then electronically receive them and negotiate them in the building. And so we could print out eventually, all your pictures of checks, but those checks were physically never presented for payment anymore. And so it was around this time that you stopped getting your checks. And, that's okay. And I think that our system developed more from it, but, it was just one of the side effects that I noticed working in a computer room at a bank during the time of the Murrah bombing. So, there you go. You stop getting your checks in the mail. The Federal Reserve reopened. We were able to get cash. We were able to get coin. We'd heard rumors that there were going to be convoys of money trucks, coming down from Kansas City and maybe up from Dallas. Maybe that was more believable. But there didn't seem to be a plan in place to help us deal with that financial situation. So that was all going on in my life. And then the following semester, I started my student teaching. And we moved away from the Murrah bombing and the death of more than 160 people, which most people in Oklahoma know at least one or two people who died in that. And I'm no exception. To this day, I have a friend who has a chair in the Oklahoma City Memorial. And I wish I had the courage to go see her chair more often. I've seen it once, and in 30 years, I've never ever wanted to go see it again. It's just too hard for me. But in the meantime, graduated from high school, or I'm graduated from university, and my first job in teaching took me to the Republic of South Korea in 1997. A year and a half, a year and a half later or so. And as I'm walking through Korea the first time, and I realized that Oklahoma City impacted the world in ways I still don't really know the full way. But within Korea, very friendly people. But when they don't know, when they don't know English, they sometimes are goofy in their responses, as I'm sure we are when we meet Koreans over here for the first time. But there was a guy on a bike, and he was fascinated with me because I lived in a town that didn't have a lot of Westerners at that point, so I was still a novelty to them. And he drove his bike around me in a few circles, and I felt like he was a little bit older than me. And he asked me, "Where are you from?" And I said, "I'm from Oklahoma City." And he looked at me and he went, "Boom! You had a terrible bomb." And my response probably wasn't the kindest. I wasn't angry with him, but I was shocked. I think my mouth dropped and I just kept on walking. I couldn't even engage him in a conversation after that because these feelings were extremely fresh in my mind and I didn't know what to make of that. Uh, it was traumatic. I did write about it in my journal, and I got beyond that, and I got to where I was liking Korean music, and K-pop was experiencing, its growth for the time. And one of my favorite K-pop bands in the late 90s was HOT, High Five of Teenager, and I love their songs. And they had a song they covered for Salt and Pepper, and it was just I felt really good, and it was hard to be depressed listening to this music. So I bought their album, and I was so excited. It was my first Korean CD, and I was on the bus from the department store, and I pulled all the cellophane off of it, and I opened it up and pulled out the lyrics, and I was happy they had the lyrics, and they were in Korean, and I could actually read them. And then I looked at the liner notes, and the liner notes said, "We hate all kinds of violence," which is nothing wrong with that, but it was superimposed on a picture of the Murrah bombing in Oklahoma City. And those of you who have never seen that, when you see this bombing, you see this building bombed, you look at it and you realize that more than 800 people were hurt and that close to 200 people died, in that building. And it was just very fresh for me. It was at this point that I stopped really trying to remember or navigate the feelings I had about the Murrah bombing, and I proceeded to bury those emotions, and I still have them. And unfortunately, the way my mind works, it's as fresh as if it happened yesterday. And so I tend to not want to revisit this topic. But some insight is kind of interesting with how the banking industry worked and how Oklahoma City financially responded to this tragedy. And we had a lot we had to respond to. Billions of dollars of damage, neighboring buildings destroyed. It was all crazy. But after the end of a couple years, I was able to come back from Korea, and I got my first job in Oklahoma City Public Schools. Woohoo! And I've been lucky enough to teach in that district for my entire career. And I'm within a few years of retiring, so this is something that I need to revisit. And I was teaching third grade at a school named Lafayette Elementary, and we were in school one day, and I was the technology model classroom, so I was the only classroom that had a TV set in it. And we would do things like watch the news and things of that nature. And it seems like it was around the same time. I mean, maybe not, but it seems like it was around the same time in 2001 on September 11th that somebody walked into my room and said, "There's been a terrible accident in New York City. And I thought, a terrible accident. And so I leaned back, and the kids saw my stress, and they're like, what's going on? And we were like, I don't know. Apparently there's a plane crash in New York City. So all the kids were like buzzing at that time, blah, 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 blah. So there was no education that was going to happen according to a lesson plan. So what we did was I turned on the TV to a newsy show, and talked with the kids about, because all the kids in Oklahoma City remembered or had heard their siblings talk about, after the Murrah bombing, everybody sent teddy bears to Oklahoma City, and they gave it to every kid. And so a kid said, do you think they're going to send teddy bears to those kids in New York City? And I said, they might. And I thought, well, that would be a fun thing to do, a little fundraiser or contribute $20 to. And so we started making little cards, because we knew that this was going to be traumatic for the little kids in New York City. So my class, we got out construction paper and markers and crayons, because this guy does not do paint. He does not do paint in a classroom with 8-year-olds who would rather eat it than paint with it. So we got all the other things I did allow in my classroom, and we started making little cards. And some little girls like, we know what happened to you because it happened to us, so we hope you feel better. And I got a big manila envelope, and we'd addressed it to any third grade class in New York City. And we started making these cards, and we had the news on in the corner, and we were chit-chatting and everything, when out of the corner of my eye, I saw the second plane hit the second tower. And so instantly I knew that it was not an accident. And I became frightened. It scared me to death. And I was afraid of freaking out in front of the class. And I instantly went back to the Murrah bombing of several years earlier. And I was like, what to do? So anyway, because I was a third grade teacher, and because I saw that and knew it was no longer an accident, I felt like we were under attack and that it was a war attack. And so I casually went across the room and turned on the radio and turned off the TV simultaneously. And the radio I chose was just a music station, some easy listening. And they were like, why did you turn it off? I said, we'll turn it on if there's something important later, but I just didn't want my kids to see hundreds of people in their lives, or have their lives ended right there in front of them. I feel like if that's going to happen, that's something that should happen at your home with the guidance of your parents. And so we continued to make our cards and everything like that. And then a teacher came in, and Oklahoma City has Tinker Air Force Base. And although nobody talks about it, the stealth bombers maintain a fleet there. And so I'm pretty sure we have atomic weapons here in Oklahoma City, because here in the state is where we build a lot of the munitions used by the military. So I have no doubt that there's things going on at Tinker that we don't even know about. And she walked in and she said, a plane just crashed into the Pentagon. And I was like, what? I couldn't even believe it. I had to step out in the hall to ask her what the hell was going on. And then she said there's a missing plane, and they're grounding all the airplanes. And sure enough, I went to the window of my classroom, and there were no planes in the sky, and there always is because of the airport. But there were fighter jets, and they seemed to be going, across the city. And then I started looking out the window, and I looked down at the ground while I was looking up at the sky, and I looked down at the ground, and the gas station across the street, the gas, which was around, closer to $1, it seemed like, all of a sudden was $3 or $4. And this was in 2001, and that didn't seem right. And then the traffic seemed to be backed up like a mile or two long. And apparently everybody who was what am I trying to say? Not working, was putting gas in their car because they thought we were at war, and everybody thought it was Iran at the time. And we started getting news reports on the radio about toilet papers off the shelves, and there's no more canned soup at Walmart, and all these other things that were going on. And I was starting to feel a little ripped off that I was stuck in class with all these dramatic events happening in our school day. So we turned the TV back on to see some local news, but and we left it on. And then I happened to notice that people were jumping, and I hadn't considered at this point that the buildings were in danger of collapsing or anything. I felt like people were going to go to the roof and there were going to be helicopters that would pick up the people and take them down, because I've seen those kind of rescues before. And I knew that there was no way that anybody above the point where the planes crashed were going to be able to go below and then down the elevators or and staircases. So I expected all of that to happen, but then I was surprised to start seeing people jump out of this building, and it was on TV. And I flashed back to April 19th so bad, and a lot of people in Oklahoma City did too. And for the first few days of the World Trade Center attack, we didn't call them the planes, the planes flying into the towers. We called them the bombing of the World Trade Center, because most of us were remembering the bombing of the Murrah building. And I know in my case, that was painfully clear. I confused the two in my mind frequently, in the first week of this event. And so we ended up making our cards. We did see the towers collapse. I tried to minimize the questions we had with the class. One of my little kids threw up, and that's when parents started checking their kids out of school. And when you look at the checkout logs from this time period in Oklahoma City and probably any other school, the reasons the kids were checked out were our nation's at war, because Iran's attacked our country, or because of this and because of that. And it was all horrific. And after a couple days, the kids started coming back to school, but I had a little boy who wouldn't come back to school, and I ended up calling his mom, and she told me, she said, well, our last name's Ahmed, and they saw the president of Pakistan speaking, after this happened, and he was denying that Pakistan had anything to do with this. And you may recall, this leader of Pakistan in front of a whole bunch of microphones. One of the microphones said Ahmed on it. And so this little third grader in my class was convinced that we all hated him, and that we thought that he was the person who did this bombing this attack on the World Trade Center in New York City. And the mom said she said she didn't know how to make him feel safe, and he didn't want to come to school or anything. And she said, she feels like there's some Islamic backlash at this point. And she could very well have been right, in that, that natural feeling, because people search in their pain. They search for any kind of explanation for what has happened. But I told her, I said, ma'am, young Ahmed is very popular in our class, and we miss him. And I said, is there anything we can do to make him feel better, or make you feel better about coming to school? And she said she really didn't think so. She said, nobody in your school has a name like him. And I said, well, ma'am, my name is Benjamin Aaron, and I believe in the Middle East, in Hebrew, it would be Binyamin Aharon. And I said, I know that in Arabic, my name means son of the right hand. And I forgot off the top of my head what Aaron meant, but I did tell her, I said, I have a Jewish name and I'm Christian, but I promise you that somebody who wanted to go after this little kid named Ahmed in my class is going to have to go through their angry Jewish name teacher. I said, I will do everything I can to keep your kids safe. And so guess what? That afternoon, he came back to school, and I will never forget the hug I got from him. And then, of course, the world began to move on from 9/11. I continued to teach. Years later, I taught at an elementary school, and I had a kid with a lot of facial scars. And he told me that the kids called him Scarface. And I was like, say hello to my little friend. And he was like, no. He said, everybody says that, but they're all grown and old. And he said, I've got all these scars, and they call me Scarface because I was in the Murrah bombing. And I was like, oh my God, because, those were some very poignant things that happened. And apparently he was a child who suffered a lot of damage, in the Murrah bombing. And that bonded us for a little bit. And I was big about Korean. I always showed the kids how to write their names in Koreans, and he felt really good. And I said, you must be really brave. I said, you need to look at every one of those scars that you have, and you need to be proud of them. And if somebody is making fun of you, well, they're stupid, and you need you need to come and tell me. And if it's a kid, I'll have at him. But if it's somebody in your neighborhood, let your mom and dad know, because you do not need to feel bad about anything that happened. It was not your fault. And we had a great relationship, and he was in the newspaper several years later, having died. But one of the things that they put in the paper was how he had survived the Murrah bombing, and he wanted to grow up and he wanted to move to Japan, that he loved Asian culture. And part of that was me. Part of that was me. And I'm still so sad that his dream didn't come true. But I will always remember him and memorialize him in every way I can. So I want to close out this rather long video for me by saying that PTSD is a real thing. I never really thought that PTSD could be a real thing. I mean, I heard people having flashbacks after Vietnam and, hitting their wives at night, and everything because they thought they were under attack. And I really thought it was like, nah, But I'm sitting here 30 years, almost 30 years after the end of the Murrah bombing, and it's as fresh to me whenever I allow myself to think about it as it was on that day. So I'm also sympathetic to people who've gone through 911. I'm sympathetic to people who've been in wars overseas. I'm sympathetic with adults who are as frightened as young children are and don't know how to handle it. In addition to the Murrah bombing and 911 here in Oklahoma, a lot of us are traumatized by the dozens of tornadoes. And that some of you know my tornado story, and maybe I'll do a video on that sometime when I can find a numismatic link. I haven't been able to yet, but we've had a lot here in Oklahoma to traumatize us. And I'll be honest with you, sometimes I think it's funny and amusing when people talk about Oklahoma and some of the edgy things that they'll say about Oklahoma. But I'm like, we've survived a lot. And rather than talk about us, or rather than make fun of people, regardless of their ethnic background and their situation, it would be nice if you know any people who've gone through things like the Murrah bombing, or 911, or tornadoes, or murders and deaths, or car wrecks, that you would just give them a hug. Just give them a hug. If you live near an Oklahoman, I hope you would give them a hug, a handshake. And I know that Frosties from Wendy's always make me feel better too. So I want you to feel loved, and I want you to feel very welcome this fall whenever you come to Oklahoma City for the A&A show. But I want you to consider how these events can sometimes affect you in a money way, and in a personal way, and in an emotional way. And I hope this video is the only one I ever do that's like this, that's this painful, and that has giant spaces where I just have been unable to say anything because I just don't want to cry in front of you. I love doing my channel. I love doing my bank notes, but I've been thinking about this video and how I needed to do this video for quite some time. Thank you for indulging me, and if you survived this video to this point, to the 38-minute mark, you're truly one of my heroes. And if you ever meet me in person or want to have conversations about these aspects, I'm prepared to have these conversations with anybody who wants to have them. In spite of how I may respond. I just want to end this video like I end all my videos. I am Benjamin. This is Numismatic Notes with Benjamin. And I want you to have a jewel of a day.